Hi, I'm Jennifer Lange, and curator in the Film Video Studio, and I'm here with Jeanne Liotta, who is a filmmaker artist, tuning in from Colorado, and we're going to have a quick conversation about her film Crosswalk, which is outside of the box this month. Hi, Jeanne.
Hi, Jennifer. So nice to see you again. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And even under the strange circumstances where in the box becomes out of the box, I'm very pleased to have my film Crosswalk playing, especially during this holiday month with Easter, Passover, spring in all of its incarnations. It's the perfect time of year for it.
So when I originally programmed this, that's what I was thinking about, and the fact that we hadn't shown it, which kind of baffled me because it's such a beautiful film. It was post-produced in the Film Video Studio about 10 years ago, like exactly 10 years ago, right?
I think I did 2 sessions in 2010, one in the late spring where I did most of the editing process, and then I came back I think at the end of the summer or some point in the summer to do all the tiny finishing and whatnot.
Yeah, and so it seemed like a sort of the perfect piece for an April box program, and then all this the reality of coronavirus, COVID-19, those circumstances forced us to close the physical building. And so physical exhibition was no longer possible, but then you very generously agreed to show the video streaming online. And then as I was writing about this, writing my essay for the piece, which was going to go online, just occurred to me, such a strange time. This was like mid-March that I'm writing about this. And it's just, it's a completely different context to think about this piece, which seems so much about humanity and human bodies occupying public spaces. What's it like for you to revisit Crosswalk?
Yes, I mean, I just watched it recently, with all of this in mind, and the isolation that we're all experiencing right now, of course. And New York is so special in that way because, public life is it is synonymous with New York, more than most other cities. I've had the experience in a few other cities in the world that I've been to, Naples in Italy, for example, which I've been to many times and have a nice relationship with that town. And I think a lot of the reason is that they're very dedicated to public life there. Life really happens in the street. And it's noisy and it's complicated and there's like so many layers, many more layers, even there perhaps in some ways. And of course, a lot of the Italian immigrants in New York especially come from Southern Italy. So there's a lot of correlation between those two towns. But the proximity of bodies and the everyday jostling of all sorts of intersecting bodies and spaces and realities, in fact, right? Because what really struck me about that film, okay, yes, Good Friday, Semana Santa, we have this, procession that takes place that's really like this kind of a poverty theater in a certain way. It's really basic and grassroots. There's nothing fancy. It's not made for spectatorship. It's made for the people themselves. All of those things really were important to me. But also, this is my neighborhood. I come from immigrant families. Many other immigrant families are all around me, and I often, walk through the neighborhood and think, wow, everyone lives in their own New York. They track it differently. Of course, their cultural backgrounds, but what year you got there, what neighborhood you walked into, which communities you intersected with. I brought up my child in that neighborhood, so I know a lot of people from the schools, and there's just so many ways that all these different lives are intersecting all the time, every minute. That's what it's all about.
And you've talked about this work as being a kind of collage of time. And
Mm.
this is yet another layer of time that's because of the circumstances being layered onto it. No, it
Yeah.
definitely, there's like a sadness to it too, you know, even though it feels very celebratory and it is about spring. Watching it from today's perspective, there's a sense of longing, you know, of wanting that proximity again, and wanting to be able to perform those traditions that are so important spiritually,
Yeah, isn't
emotionally.
that, I definitely felt this incredible yearning as I watched it, you know, that sense of tactility. I wanted to touch people
Yeah,
as they were touching each other, you know, and I'm like, wow, who would have thought? I mean, of course, when I look at it, and it's 10 years old, but I was shooting it probably, you know, 5 years at least before that time. So there's so much information in the film that, like any mythological tale, appeals to different people depending on what their knowledge base is, you know. So for locals, when we look at a film like that, I'm like, oh, yeah, the M9 bus doesn't go on Avenue B anymore. I mean, this is like, it doesn't mean anything to anyone unless, you know, you're like
unless it
live
does.
on Avenue B,
Right.
right? Or like, oh, the kimono store, that didn't last too long, you know. So there's all these little details in there. And I noticed something I never talk about, but today struck me for some reason, as we're in the section of the film, I think, where I'm shooting from my roof, because a lot of this was shot really in my neighborhood around my home. And I was up on the roof looking down at the street, and there's a street corner, Avenue B and 3rd Street, East 3rd, where the street sign has been renamed for Pedro Pietri. And you can see it's like one of those honorific signs that they make for street corners. And I was like, oh yeah, you know, like this is like a little tiny in-joke in a way. He was a poet in the neighborhood who was influential in the Nuyorican poetry community. And he used to perform in the streets by declaiming poetry and carrying a cross on his back that had condoms on it. This was in the middle of the AIDS era. And this is just something I saw quite often when I was younger, you know, and when I see that street sign, I immediately make the connection to Jesus as we see him walking down the street carrying that cross.
Right.
For me, Pedro Pietri is also there. Just an example of, you know, the many levels of knowledge that are going on here. And, you know, because I was in that apartment from 1987, I saw a certain set of conditions and life in the Lower East Side that someone who came 10 years later wouldn't have seen it. And who knows what the future will bring now, as we all sit inside of our apartments. And what is the future of public life? I don't know. Maybe it comes back in full force.
One can only hope.
One can hope. I think the desire is there, no?
Yes, it is there for sure. Absolutely. I mean, your sort of very research-based practice, I think is really interesting. And I ended up doing quite a bit of research. Well, you know, you sort of, you watch something and then you dig a little bit deeper and then you go down these wormholes. And I actually learned quite a bit about the neighborhood, the Lower East Side neighborhood, and the transformation of it, and the importance actually of the church that I believe originated the public procession, which is St. Bridget's Church, I think was the one that originated it, and how politically active that
and we see that
was.
church.
You see that church at the end, exactly, which almost closed. I think that year there was but it was incredibly politically active parish that was very much involved in, you know, the AIDS crisis and in during the 80s, that neighborhood was an entirely different neighborhood than it is today. When did you move there?
I think, well, I went to NYU like 1980, so I have been there for a long time.
So you've seen that
my daughter was, I mean, my daughter was born in the middle 80s, you know, we lived through the AIDS crisis, we lived through the Tompkins Square riots. There's been a lot of activity, and part of the Tompkins Square riots had to do with the, you know, crazy rise of homelessness and the Dinkinsville, as we called it at the time, because of the mayor, David Dinkins, who supposedly was criticized for allowing all of these homeless encampments. St. Bridget's was really influential in feeding a lot of homeless, and still, I think, for a very long time, kept up that practice. So yeah, they were on the front lines.
And that Stations of the Cross, I mean, I think this happens in some communities, but that particularly the public procession of the Stations of the Cross was, it marks these moments, important moments leading up to the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. But the stops were more politically bound to current politics and social issues, and I thought that was really interesting. I went down a whole wormhole, Jeannie. I feel like I know a lot about the Lower East Side and about Catholicism.
Well, some people have said to me like, oh, it's very interesting, but like, we don't really care about religion. And I mean, this isn't really a film about religion. I just want to say that. Yeah. For me, this is a film about New York. And although I was, of course, raised Italian and Irish, I know exactly what this story is that I'm seeing portrayed on the streets. And this film is my active participation in that ritual in my way. Right? This is how I can participate in it, not by standing on the sidelines, but actually, I kept in all of the audio that was maybe considered disruptive, of like jostling and moving. And that included me running to keep up with what was happening. And it's really important for me to people to understand this as a celebration of New York, a celebration of history and layers and diversity. And also the cyclical nature of so many things, right? I mean, these religious celebrations are ancient, pre-Christianity, they're pagan, celebrating the actual rebirth, right? Of that spring is. So that's all important to me too. And the theatrical nature, as you mentioned, right, of the processions is important. And the theater of the streets includes the NYPD, right? I mean, to me, they're stars of this movie as much as anyone else, right?
Definitely. And the soundtrack is so much, is when we're talking about collage and even layers of time and references, the soundtrack is so lush and rich and evocative of city life. It feels, I mean, that for me is where this, it's like I'm I don't know how to describe it exactly, but I feel like I'm in the midst of an ancient ritual and in the most like present contemporary life. It mixes so beautifully and evocatively for me in this film.
Thank you so much, because really that's where the work took place in this film. I mean, most of the editing that we're seeing visually, most of that is in camera. I shot this on Super 8 film, really shot from the hip, literally many times, sometimes not even looking through the lens at all, just kind of moving. But the real editing and the real montage was happening in the audio. And that's exactly what I wanted to do, was to like completely mesh all the eras simultaneously. And, this is besides an experiential audio, right? Because this is kind of the way it is in New York. People open a door to a bodega and like this beautiful song pops out and the door closes and the song goes away, trucks going by. This is how it takes place. But, I was really, really influenced by Pasolini. And I think I've mentioned this before in other interviews, but, he was really a driving force for a lot of this work in the notion of the collaging of time, which I think I spoke about in my interview with Chris Stultz, but it really is such a key piece. I was reading this biography, Enzo Siciliano's biography of Pasolini, and it's very thick, and one of the many stories in there talked about his relationship with, art, of course, and how he, in a sense, was making collage just like the Renaissance painters. It was mentioned in the biography. And I was like, the Renaissance painters, how were they doing collage? We didn't have collage in the Renaissance, right? I'm thinking. I called up some painter friends of mine. I'm like, what do you think? So I jumped on the subway and went up to the Met, right? Luckily that was there waiting for me. And I just had to figure out what they were talking about. And I walked through the halls of the Renaissance paintings. And there it's very obvious, right, that we see the Virgin and Child painted sitting inside of a space with like a curtain, very theatrical behind them. And in the distance, you see the city, right? Verona, or, you know, whatever the city is in Italy, some village, whatever it may be. That's actually the present day reality of the painter. Right? So he's inserting this mythological, historical characters into that present moment. And so this was really influential for Pasolini, of course, and that in turn influenced me. You look at the faces as when he was trying to cast his films, was always looking far afield for faces that didn't really contain, you know, some modern urbanity. He was looking for those ancient faces, like still alive. And this was influential too. I look at all those faces in Crosswalk and they are timeless. You know, people are like transmitting throughout history into this one moment. And lastly, my last piece about Pasolini, I just want to say, getting back to the audio, is that he had this term that he called stylistic contamination. You know, and you'll see that he would play records of like the 60s on top of, you know, a scene where people are trying to, you know, get in position for a film scene. You know, anyway, he moved around those influences quite a bit and did make collage between audio and picture, right? So sound and picture were coming from completely different areas. And it's a beautiful form of editing that, you know, it's this collision of different time periods that, you know, really produces the present in ourselves. Right. That we can look at something that seems so ancient and it feels like the daily news, you know? That's the feeling I mean, it's a lively feeling that really makes us not even reflect, because we're so present, we can't reflect. It's life itself.
You've talked about this a little bit before in relation to some of your other work that deals with a different kind of heavenly body, if you will, the celestial bodies. This idea of I think you described being directed to a star, a specific star, and being able to, you know, it was an older text, very old text, and it gave you the coordinates, and if you know, go from here to here, you will see this, and you were able to follow these. It's sort of a similar idea.
That's true. I hadn't quite thought of it like that. When I mean, obviously the cosmic realm has been really the place where I've spent most of my time as an artist, certainly in the last decade. And when I think about its relationship to Crosswalk, people are like, well, you know, you're not a street photographer. And I'm like, I guess I'm not, but how about I am now? And for me, the association between, you know, the cosmic films like Observando and many others, and Crosswalk was paying attention to the cyclical nature of things, right? I mean, even in Crosswalk, I look down so that we see the many little suns that are appearing, you know, on the sidewalk, for example. I'm like, I have a few cosmic pieces in there just to remind people. So, I mean, and that the Semana Santa, right, the procession happens once a year. So basically you have, you know, maybe 1 hour per year that you could capture this image, right? And this is certainly true. I mean, you know, I have to wait till the nighttime if I want to see certain things in the night sky. I may have to wait until the winter in order to look at certain constellations, right? So there is that kind of cyclical patience and, you know, recursiveness, right? That is super interesting to me.
Right.
And the instructions, yeah, I guess so. Maybe the more I learned about astronomy, because I knew very little when I began, you know, as a city girl, right? I knew the moon and the Big Dipper and
Orion, right?
Orion, that was it. I knew there was another one.
He's a big one. Or Cassiopeia is a big one too.
That was, you know, I had to learn it.
Look
Totally.
The W in the sky, and then you've got Cassiopeia.
Yes, exactly, right? This is how we learn things. And certainly the more I became familiar with what I was looking at in the night sky, I could like, I felt like they were friends. The stars are not really to anthropomorphize it so much, but I felt a familiarity with the stories. And those stories, the reason that I learned anything about astronomy at all is because of mythological tales. You know, I knew the Greek and Roman mythologies, so I could actually like use that literary knowledge, right, to like help me figure out what the structure was.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not dissimilar, you're right, as
Well,
to like understanding what the story is of Crosswalk. So the structure is already available, right?
yeah. Oh, it was an interesting way to think about it, definitely.
Yeah.
So you're in Colorado right now, still teaching.
I am. Yes, I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm associate professor in the Cinema Studies and Moving Image Arts program, and I run the grad program for film, which is part of the arts practices and art history. So we got a lot going on here,
Yeah.
and we're trying to hold it all together.
Will you go back to New York? I mean, I wanted to ask you what the view out your window was right now in New York, but I can't ask that question.
I wish I could answer it.
We can imagine there's great emptiness.
Yeah, indeed. I am sheltering in place, but I expect to return home at the end of the semester, and you know, to that very apartment where I shot so many of my films. I go up on the roof. It's like my outdoor shooting studio.
So what are you working on? What are you working on now?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm actually working on a project that's all in 35 millimeter slides. So these are slides. This is a super top secret, everyone. I'm working with old NASA slides that I've acquired over the years. You know, of course, all the images that NASA produces are free and available to the public, right? Publicly funded. But nobody makes 35 millimeter slides anymore. Obviously, now if you want to look at the latest images from NASA, you can go online and see everything, and it's fantastic. I mean, they have the best website in the world. All the different satellites that are out there imaging are being sent back, and there's a lot of amazing work being done by, you know, citizen artists and scientists who are compiling, right, all of this data themselves, and people are really having a lot of fun with the NASA stuff. It's great. I watch it all the time. I'm really into it. But for me, it was more interesting now to think about working with the hands-on material. I've been feeling a great need, interestingly enough, to move away from the screen, the computer screen. I'm not getting my wish in this moment of sheltering in place.
Yeah.
And it's right how interesting that suddenly the screens have become like our lifeline.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I have been working with these original slides that NASA would produce, and you know, you could buy them in gift shops, you know, dedicated to science materials, and you could even go online and order them from NASA, and you could get a whole set of slides, beautiful slides, and their little, you know, square holders that had printed information about what it is you were looking at. And I've been working with them in a variety of ways, trying to think about, I don't know, a cosmic imaginary where I'm looking at these images and trying to like force myself into a larger time scale.
Okay.
By, I know I'm trying not to give too much away because I'm so much in the middle of it right now, but I'm working with a variety of.
Will it be a moving image work or
Well,
will you use slide projectors?
I will use slide projectors. Yeah, I'll use the original projectors, and it will move in the sense that images will come and go.
Mm-hmm.
So that it will take place over time in some ways. Both. It'll be installed, and I have a variety of setups that I'm working on that do different things with slide projectors. So I'm really interested anyway in right now. I'm sitting at my desk looking at tiny little slides and working with them in material ways. Let's just put it that way.
That is exciting, and also feels very, yes, as you said, in a reality of Zoom fatigue and screen fatigue. something really grounding.
Yeah, it is very grounding to work with the hands. And, this is something that we all love about, film. And Crosswalk, was shot on Super 8, as I said, a very home movie, immediate kind of a medium. And I did transfer it to digital and to do the cutting, mostly because I knew that most of the cutting was going to be happening in the audio, right? Because it's, as I said, it's really shot in camera for the most part. But then, you know what I did? I actually transferred the film to 35 millimeter. I really wanted to make a 35 millimeter print, thinking about Pasolini, thinking about the stars of my film who are, just regular people in my neighborhood. And I'm like, I could make them movie stars. I mean, for one film, let me do that. I had access at my university to some certain equipment that allowed me to do that with the help of some grad students. I was able to make a 35 millimeter print of that film. So I kept my hand in the material. And actually, can I just, a little anecdote about that? Because I think that when I was at the Wexner, I was just starting to figure out the 35 millimeter process. I had never worked with 35 before. And even though I'm very familiar with film, there were things that I did not know. And thanks to, I forget his name, but the projectionist.
Bruce.
No, the projectionist.
Bruce. He retired. He just retired.
Oh, Bruce really helped me. Thanks, Bruce. He was so patient with me and showed me about, how it works, what I needed to pay attention to when I was splicing. And he let me use his 35 splicer and sat in the booth. He didn't bother me unless I asked him a question. And I always think about that as a really, it was very nice. Bruce.
That's a good story. No, we have a new projectionist, Rachel, who's absolutely amazing also. And it's interesting how many residencies we end up pulling a projectionist into a residency because people have questions about how to finish things.
Yeah.
So it's nice.
I mean, that's the hard thing about making films these days is figuring out your workflow. There's so many options. That's, very key. And also Paul, since you mentioned him, shout out to Paul Hill, who helped me with my audio mix, made fun of me because he said, you did almost all the work. And I was like, I didn't know. I was just trying to figure it out. But he helped me through a lot of that in the end. And we had some productive discussions, in fact, about how much to leave all of that raw audio, for example, like that jostling around I was talking about. And he really helped me think through that and fight for what I wanted. So
that's good. We would like to have you, we love to have artists return and make other projects through the residency program, and we would love to have you back. So open invitation.
And I would love to come back. Let's do that.
Let us definitely do that. Stay on after I stop recording, but thank you very much for this time and for the generosity of letting us stream your film Crosswalk this month. It's perfect timing.
Well, I'm so happy to be part of the Wexner family. It's really been very influential in my life, and I thank you as well, Jennifer.
Thank you.